Hello, everyone. This is Ed Brenniger, and welcome to the Eddie Network podcast. My guest today is Alex Carabi, and Alex has written a book that I absolutely love called On Relationality. I got that right, didn't I, Alex?
Yes, you did.
How about
Nicely
that?
done.
If you know me, you know that I am very oriented around relationships. And so when I saw this on LinkedIn last week, I reached out to Alex and said, "Hey, let's talk." And I said, "I'll get your book," and I've read it, and I really like it, and I think you will too. And I think it's one of those. I'm making the pitch before we even talk to you. Um, I think it's one of those books you're going to want to buy multiple copies of and give to your team, because I think what he is setting up for us is a way of looking at our relationships within business or with any social context about how we can work together. So that's that's why this is going to be an important conversation today. So welcome, Alex. I'm glad to know you, and tell us about a little bit of who you are and what you do, and how you came to write this book.
Well, it's great to be here. Thanks so much for the invitation and the warm welcome. Yeah, so I am how should we put it? It's a tricky question, like who you are and what you're up to. So many ways of going at that. And I think that's one of the frameworks of the book itself, actually, which is there's so many ways that we can relate to each other and actually look at who we are. But if we start with perhaps the CV details and so on, these days I work primarily as a coach, and the way I like to describe that is I help people to unfold more of who they are.
Mm.
In a world where there's so much about growth and being productive and efficient and effective. There's actually natural, organic ways that we can grow in life that don't demand extra force or pressure. We can actually unfold who we are, just like any plant or any animal or any living organism does. We unfold who we are. And so I help people to do that in their capacities as leaders, but also as humans and as parents or whatever else they're up to in life. And so I do that as a coach, working with leaders from around the world, helping them essentially to become more of who they are as leaders and to become more effective in that process. But again, without trying hard and instead just kind of showing up as who they are. I also help run and facilitate a space called Yellow, which I've co-founded with a colleague of mine, Rob Poynton, and it's a space where we bring together small groups of people for 6 months and we take them on a journey into the unknown. It's an unscripted, curriculum-free program of learning and self-development, you could say. And really exploring both relationality, but also who we are. Our tagline is it helps you to catch a glimpse of yourself. So that's something I get up to. And I also facilitate and help host coaching trainings for an online coaching platform called Coaches Rising, which runs coaching training for hundreds of people from around the world. And as you mentioned, I've recently come out with a book called On Relationality, which touches on some key and core themes to what I believe in and how I work with people. And it's based upon the ideas of the philosopher Martin Buber, who had a lot to say about relationality. And I've taken his ideas and interwoven them with some of my own thinking that is very much influenced from coaching work, but also therapeutic, developmental trauma healing work as well. So that's a bit about who I am and what I'm up to. And yeah, let's see where we go from here.
You got me where you were describing how to help coach people without putting pressure on. Oh my! I said, how does he do that? I want to know how do you do that because there is, maybe it's an American thing, but there is so much pressure put on all of us to perform and to excel and be at the top of our game all the time. And it's, it's, I mean, I feel it. I mean, I know everyone else feels it. And I'm probably less of more immune to that kind of stuff than most people, but I still feel it. I mean, I'm up at usually 4 in the morning working, and there's pressure to produce. I got to write, got to write, got to write. Then I got, oh God, I got to do the post production on tomorrow's podcast. So how, we'll get to your book in a minute, but how do you frame a conversation with a client where you're actually releasing them from this pressure?
Mm. Yeah. So the way I like to think about it is that we essentially learn, many of us learn, to put extensive pressure on ourselves, right? So there might be pressure in society, or that's how we like to talk about it. But essentially, the deep kind of pain and difficulty with all of this is the pressure we put on ourselves. And it's actually quite relentless if you dig into people and their backgrounds and their experience of life. And just to notice how much of a filter it is actually to see the world and see oneself through this lens of pressure. And I need to work hard. I need to put pressure on myself. And so one way that I work with people around that is to say, well, that's number one, that's pretty interesting. Number two, how do you do that? Like, I'm curious because it shows up differently in all of us. How do you actually do this? And so people will generally say, yeah, I, talk to myself in a certain way. I put these expectations on myself. Okay, that's interesting. So that's kind of the experience of it. How does that sit in your body or in your emotional realm? So we get to know all parts of us, not just the cognitive. But then to also inquire into, so let's play around with the idea that one day you wake up and you are not putting any pressure on yourself whatsoever. What's wrong with that picture? Or what might you lose that you value? And in most cases, the response is something akin to, ooh, but without that pressure, I would lose my drive. I would lose kind of any impetus to actually make things happen. So I think very early on, many of us learn that this pressure, because we know it so well and we've learned it for various reasons, which we can look at. But one assumption I hold is that every strategy that we have in life is ultimately serving some purpose. Maybe decades ago when we were children and had to adopt that strategy to receive attention, love, support, care. But nevertheless, we kind of want to honor it and we don't want to judge it. But when we notice and honor that strategy of pressuring oneself, we can see that if it started very early and it was crucial to our survival, then it kind of gets fused with our identity and it gets fused with anything we achieve in life. And so, disentangling these becomes an impossibility. It's something we don't even want to dare contemplate because we're scared that we'll lose everything we value and even ourselves. So these are some of the kind of entry points that I might enter into discussion and conversation around someone around these themes.
That's really insightful, because I think when that entangling, it creates a level of comfort, even
Right.
though it's difficult. And when
Yep.
we disentangle that, it creates some trauma. At the same time, it's also freeing us. So it's a complicated thing. I'm
Yeah.
hearing you say, and
Yeah.
which
They talk about that as I learned it as we experience in those moments when we contemplate releasing ourselves of that as an illusion of release. It's an illusion of what might happen when we're released from that strategy.
uh,
And it's illusion not to deny the person's experience of it, because
right,
if they feel it's really scary, it's scary. Like, I don't want to deny that. But it's an illusion in the sense that my life might be threatened, or it's an illusion that I might not be myself if I'm not pressuring myself anymore, or I might expose myself to danger. That's probably not the case today. It was probably 40 years ago,
yeah.
definitely, but not so much today.
So, so how many of these folks that you work with um, come to you having the sense? I mean, it's explicit in what they say that they're in transition and they don't know where their transition is leading.
Ultimately, all, but not always in an explicit transition.
Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
So people will generally come to me when there is something, there's either kind of a pebble in their shoe. It sounds like something's kind of off, right? And I sense I need to look at something here. Uh, or they're in kind of a corporate setting or running a startup or whatever, and they're just faced with either, again, pressuring themselves or pressure from the environment, uh, wanting to step up in their leadership capacities and communication skills. Or people who have, you know, done their thing for a while, either run a business or something else, and now having done that for a while, maybe sold their business, left that job, are entering into transition in that, you know, they want to start the next phase of their life, the second half of their life,
Mm-hmm.
and are unsure or insecure about who they are or what they want that to look like. Um, and even without any of those, I think number one, we're always in transition, right? So to pretend that we're static is I think a faulty assumption.
Agree.
But the extent to which people are aware of that, I think varies. But if we spend enough time in conversation, they'll always realize, okay, yeah, I'm wanting something different here. Otherwise, they wouldn't come to me. If everything was hunky dory and everything's just smooth sailing, then they wouldn't need to dive into all of these things with me.
When I wrote my book Circle of Impact,
Mhm.
which is here, my purpose, I saw that my marketing avatar were people who are in transition, and that that really disturbed my marketing people because they wanted it to be for CEOs or HR people, you know. No, it's for people who are in transition. And the year after it was published, I did a year of traveling around the US doing book events. And people would come up to the table and say, "So what's your book about?" It's for people in transition. Say, "Oh, well, that describes me." And I say, "Well, just tell me about that." And it was interesting that some of those transitions, and I'm sure this fits with what you're saying, were aspirational. I says,
Mm.
I've reached this point where, my children are grown and they're out of the house. Now I want to go do something else. Or my husband left me and I don't know what to do. I'm lost. And so there are all these transitions that we're going through. And the pressure for some people is what am I going to do? And the pressure for other people is how can I get into this and move through it fast so I can get to the next thing? I mean, it's this metaphor pressure, I think, is really very apt for where we are in our world today. And
Uh,
it's really a great thing.
yeah, and maybe in all those transitions, what doesn't help is again this kind of pressuring of oneself in that we should find something new, that we should do it quickly, that we should do it successfully. And this is where maybe there's a tie-in with the book itself too, which is how do we relate to ourselves? How do we
Mm-hmm.
treat ourselves actually? And to realize number one, that there's actually a relationship with myself that's going on all of the time. It's not me. I'm having a relationship with me. And once we start to if you can feel into that for a moment, then you realize, oh my goodness, there are different ways of relating then. And this is one of the key themes of the book is to open up this idea that while we're in relationship all of the time, which then second step means, okay, how do I want to relate? If it's not set in stone how I'm relating, how might I want to relate?
Are you saying um, that in that relationship we may be relating two different parts of ourselves to each other? That I perceive myself as one thing, and also perceive myself as another, and that other, using that philosophical term, that other of me is the person I'm trying to relate to and actually become maybe more like or something.
Yeah, I think there's so many different ways of exploring it. So one, there we can have an aspirational self, right? An idea of who we want ourselves to be, some kind of virtue ethic based thing where we have an ideal of who we are, and one can hold that image in different ways, right?
Mm-hmm.
You can hold that as something merely aspirational, or you can hold that as an expectation that I need to hold myself to, and otherwise I'm failed. So again, there's relationality all across the board. But overall, I would say that we have what we might call an observant self, or yeah, we might call it an observant self, who is
Okay.
observing and relating to the different parts within us. That's one way to look at it. And there are therapeutic modalities called IFS and more that actually teach you to work with oneself in that way.
So where do you want to be when you're at your healthiest in your relationship to yourself? What does that look like?
That's a great question. To claim any kind of answer here, I think would be faulty. It's something I'm working on myself all of the time. Uh,
That's
and
okay.
yet,
It really is
yeah, and
okay.
I think
I mean,
we all do, right?
yeah, I think you're right. I think, but
Yeah, yeah,
it's still
yeah.
the
I
question
think
to
what we,
ask.
yeah, what we might want to, what I aspire to at least, and what I see in my clients, at least in terms of a spectrum and a trajectory more than a destination,
Uh-huh.
is one of my teachers calls it to have rapport with self.
Mm.
To actually have rapport with yourself. Um, Another way to describe it might be an okayness. And it sounds not very interesting at first, the first time you hear it, like, okay, okayness. But it's a very particular type of okayness. It's not a indifference.
Mm.
Right? It's more of I am completely at ease and okay with where I am and who I am. This doesn't mean I necessarily condone or support everything that's going on right now. It doesn't mean I want to be here forever. It doesn't mean anything other than I am okay with myself. And I am not fighting against who I am. I am not judging myself or wanting to be anything other than what I am now. And actually, not only do I not want to be anything other, I am deeply and intrinsically grateful to be me here now. And even if I face challenges or strange or difficult, challenging thought patterns, I am relating to all of that as something that's actually a gift in a certain sense. It's a gift in my experience that I can feel all of this and have the potential and time to actually move through it if I want to. And maybe it takes a lifetime or several lifetimes. And yet I'm experiencing this, and that's amazing. And so these would be some of the components that I would say would be a healthy and effective relationship with self. But again, work in progress, I think, for all of us.
So how do you take Martin Buber's concepts and apply that in those situations?
In this situation or in general?
Yeah. Well, in the situation of itself,
Okay.
because we have I mean, you begin with the I it,
Mm-hmm.
the I thou, and I think that's an important concept. That's very important. I mean, it's the important concept to understand from Buber, and I think that's important for people that are watching and listening to
Yeah.
understand that. So, how do you describe that, and then how does that lead into um, healthy relationship building? Let's just call it that.
Yeah. So Buber had in his kind of seminal work, it's a slim volume called I and Thou from 1923. He proposed these two different ways of essentially relating. His fundamental assumption number one was actually that we're always in relationship
Hmm.
with everything, with existence, ourselves, other people. All is relationship. But then based on that assumption, he had two categories, you might say, of how we can relate. And I like to view these more as a spectrum and not necessarily a black and white dichotomy. But for the sake of argument and clarification, two categories. The first he called the I it. I almost mixed them up there. The I it. And in the I it relationship, we relate to what we meet as an object. And we reduce it to its component parts and we label. and we're very much occupied by instrumental value and use. Right. So you might relate to this pen as a pen. It's something I can use to write. I can hold it in my hand, flip it around. I can isolate what it's made of in terms of component parts. Ultimately, it's molecules and atoms. It's this very kind of reductive, instrumental use way of attending and relating to the world. Then he went on to describe what he calls the I-thou relationship. And in the I-thou relationship, words become a bit tricky because all of our language is based on a subject-object structure.
Mm-hmm.
But ultimately, I-thou is subject to subject. And you're not relating to what you meet as a thing or an object that you can pin down.
Mm-hmm.
You're simply engaging and becoming immersed in that relational encounter, becoming subsumed in relation. You become bound up in relation with the other, as he describes it. Time and space feel a bit different, and you're simply there, and the other is there. There's this timeless quality to it. And I think many of us maybe have experienced this in deep intimacy, or with a newborn child, in nature. You can have these moments of just everything fading away, and you're just there with what is. And Buber was very clear to point out that it's not that either of these is better than the other, or that we can live with only one of them, because we need to build a bridge or make things happen in the world. We do need our fair share of I-it encounters, but I think we run into difficulty and make things not only challenging, but quite it's quite sad in a way when we only live in the I-it. Buber said that himself too, that the human being cannot live in I-thou alone, because every thou is destined to become an it. But the human who lives in I-it alone is not a human.
Mm-hmm.
That is not a very human realm. That is not where we experience life. It's actually the opposite. It's an extraction and deadening of life. And so his invitation is really to not create more I-thou encounters, because you cannot create them. They come to us by grace, he points out. But what we can do is do the work, the inner work, to open ourselves up and ready ourselves to be open to and ready for the thou when that time comes. And so, to bring this back to your initial question, how does this kind of relate to,
Yeah.
there's going to be a lot of puns here, relate to how we relate with ourselves? And I think we can run into a bit of a trap if we, again, try to create I-thou relationships with ourselves. I'd say the first thing is to see where and how we're relating to ourselves as objects, as things that need to produce something, or where we relate to ourselves in terms of the instrumental value that we create in the world. For example, creating impact, right? And right, I mean, it's in the title of your book, right?
Yeah.
There's nothing wrong with impact, but depending on how we hold that term, we can end up, even though it's kind of an appreciated, often used word in the world today to somehow signify more than just what's the dichotomy here? It's like, I want to have an impact on the world, people say, right?
Right.
There's a way in which that can become an instrumental target, a KPI, just like a machine has.
Mm-hmm.
What's
Yeah.
my output, and how can I measure it? And as long as I have a lot of impact for a lot of people, I'll be okay. But until that day comes, I'm failed. And that's one way we can hold impact in terms of our relationship with ourselves. And that's an I-it kind of relationship with impact. As opposed to, I think, another way of viewing it, which is simply, as a result of me being in the world, I will have an influence on my surroundings, and my surroundings will have an influence on me. And that is an impact. And how can I get out of my own way so that I can let all of this happen in its purest, most organic form? Not pretending that I am the creator actually of all of this, but I am more of a channel. I'm more of a vehicle for what wants to happen in and through me in the world.
It seems like that we hear that I, it, I, thou, and we automatically go to seeing that as a binary choice.
Yeah.
When it's not binary at all. It's rather much more of an environment or an ecosystem or a setting where both of those are referenced in the moment that they need to be referenced. And so when I describe impact, my definition of impact is a change that makes a difference that matters.
Mm-hmm.
Something is change. That's the I, it. But what matters is something that's values based. So that's the I, thou. So the subject, we want something to happen for that subject, but actually we want something actually tangible to take place. So that's the way I view that. And I find that these binary choices that we get thrust with are really not helpful to us. And so I want to go to another part of your book that where you're referencing Ian McGilchrist's work and his asymmetrical hemispheric view of the brain, because I think that what you're describing is very compatible with what he is describing. And in fact, what you're describing is a tool for helping people take McGilchrist's ideas and put them into practice in a simple, shall I say, non-pressurized way.
Right, right. Yeah, I think there's so much overlap there, and that's one of the reasons I referenced it there in the book, which is he has these two, or he has an idea about a theory of how the brain hemispheres work, right? And I think in pop psychology, maybe 20, 30 years ago, people would say, yeah, well, the right brain is creative and the left brain is kind of rational. Right? And that is very much not, well, it's not that it's not the case. It's more that that's a deep misunderstanding that holds within it maybe a seed of truth within it.
Right.
And based on all of Ian McGilchrist's work, he describes it as the two brain hemispheres essentially attend to the world in different ways. That you could say that as two different ways of relating to the world.
Mm-hmm.
So the left brain has this kind of narrow, targeted attention. Again, it reduces things down to parts. It's very much occupied again by instrumental value use and so on. And the right brain sees context, wholeness, harmony, balance. It understands metaphor, poetry, and so on. And McGilchrist, again, makes it clear that we need both. But if we rely exclusively on the left brain, that is akin to forms of schizophrenia and psychopathology. And what we see in society is, quite interestingly, more and more kind of an externalization of that left brain. We're incentivizing it more and more. And so it's becoming kind of this image, this externalized image of that left brain. And he points out that what we want is a proper balance here, but a proper balance is not 50-50. And this is what's been called by Jonathan Rowson the McGilchrist maneuver, which is to say that it's not that we need union over division. What we need is the union of division and union.
Yeah.
And it's the same thing with the brain hemispheres, because the way the brain processes is that it starts in the right brain, in which you kind of the information that comes at you, and you see it in its context and wholeness first. Then, based on that picture, you break it down into its component parts, kind of isolating things and so on.
Mm-hmm.
But the crucial move is then to send that information back into the right hemisphere so it can be recontextualized. And so this is I think the move that we really need to make, which is to honor both and to actually remember what's a little more important at the same time.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think his work is brilliant, and I think we're going to see a lot of people like yourself applying it in really very productive, valuable ways.
I think that's actually one thing that I have seen in our work with Yellow. So this online space where we bring together small groups of people. Is actually not that we intended it at all, but it has actually ended up being a way of actually tapping into more right hemisphere ways of being in the world. For example, we start each session with, of course, there's a check-in, sort of people just chit-chatting about what's going on, but then we do a formalized check-in. And the way we do that is, and this was nothing we planned, but it just kind of emerged. I always improvise a check-in question, an embodied kind of check-in warm-up exercise, and then a question for people to check in with themselves. And all of that is improvised based on the chit chat in the beginning. So that earlier this week, we had someone talk about gardening. And so I said, okay, today's kind of warm up exercise is to move like a flower. Right? And on the face of it, it sounds like a preposterous question, right? How do you move like a flower? Flowers don't move. But then when you're actually forced to, or invited to play around with this for a moment, you realize, oh, wow, like a flower moves all the time. You know, there's wind blowing back and forth. It's growing, it's decaying, it's moving out to the sun, you know, during day and closing a bit at night. And then after that, the check-in question was, what seeds are being planted right now? And all of these questions, kind of a bit wacky as though they might sound, they disrupt our normal patterns of just answering, how are you? I'm fine, right? And you have to step into another way of being. You have to actually apply this metaphorical right hemisphere way of being in the world. And that allows you to get in touch with something else, and even a deeper reality, I would say.
Mm-hmm.
We were talking about reality earlier on, and
yeah.
Buber describes this as inclusion, in that when we're really with another person, we can include their experience in our own. And this is deeper and more profound than empathy, which is can be this kind of at a distance. I kind of feel and empathize with where you are. Inclusion goes deeper. It's like, I'm going to include all of your experience in my own as if it were my own. And Buber described this as imagining the real. And imagination, not in a sense of like fantasy or confabulation, but as our way of actually getting in touch with things that are even more real than the surface might show. And so whether it's metaphor or inclusion or something else, I think we have, if we want to, a whole range of tools at our disposal to actually get in touch with more than the surface appearance of our experience.
Yeah, I totally get that, and I totally agree with you. And I think it's I like the inclusion idea, because it forces us out of a listening posture of an analytical listening posture, of listening to, oh, I'm going to remember the points that they're making, instead of, I'm going to feel what they're feeling, and identify with those feelings, and put myself into that situation. And it's, if you can learn to do that, then your capacity for building relationships grows exponentially, because you can actually start a relationship at a place that is much further down the road, shall we say, than you would if you were simply doing it by the normal process of, okay, where are you from? Like I asked you, where are you from? What do you do? You know, that sort of thing. But the point of that is to find how the person says that, and uh, and that and how they say it is as important as what they're saying. And I think that's what you're getting at. And yeah, I think McGilchrist is on to something significant there, and it's And I've been reading and stuff, I felt like I was reading the annotated footnotes of my life, because I've been far more right brain than, but I'm not exclusively right brain. I'm also left brain, and those have not always blended well together, but they've all always been both are there, and and that experience has really elevated the what I would say is the central importance of relationship to our lives and to society at large. So let's take a few minutes to talk about that, because I think ultimately, if all they hear from us is, well, this is how we can manage relationships, and not see how significant relationships are to the whole of our lives and the whole of society, then we would need to come back and do that again in another podcast. So let's talk about that for a second, because I think it's really important.
Hmm.
So what do you think? What's how do you how do you address that with people when they their perception of most of their relationships is that they're transactional, and we're here to kind of make agreements and create exchanges so that we can survive and thrive in the world that we have. There's more to it than that.
Yeah. Right. So there's two levels that come to mind now, which we can look at this. The first is, I believe if there is someone in that relationship who is aware of that there's something more possible here,
Mm-hmm.
and who is willing to take the steps to do so, then that relationship can change. And so merely being aware that actually, oh, wow, all relationships do not have to be transactional, and I can enter into this relationship in a different way to create a different outcome. That's amazing. And if that can be accomplished, I think the world, in more of our relationships, the world would be a very different place. Instead of just taking things at face value, taking relationships as they are. Many of us grow up in life not wanting to disrupt the balance. We don't want to create disharmony or disruption. And when there is an established relationship, it's very easy through habit, but also, not wanting to shake things up too much, there can become this kind of inertia in the relationship. And so, again, becoming aware that there is a possibility to change the relationship, but also to do the inner work that's needed to be ready for that. Because transactional relationships, I get curious about what's that about and where's that coming from? Right. And we could say, yeah, that's just the way society works. That's just the way things are. Anytime someone says that's just the way things are, I get really curious.
Mm-hmm.
Because no, that's not just the way things are.
Mm-hmm.
There's reasons for that. And let's look at some of those reasons.
Yeah.
So, for example, when we grow up in situations where we learn that we need to do something in order to be okay. For example, to get my mother's love, I need to smile, or to make my father proud, I need to set the table correctly or get certain grades, or all kinds of things in more or less explicit forms. Then this kind of foundation is set that relationships are actually transactional. I need to be a certain way or do a certain thing in order to kind of get somewhere in this relationship. Fast forward decades, and there you are, and that's just how things seem to work. And a transactional relationship I see as also a separated relationship, in the sense that when we're really in relationship with another, we're just there, right? We're not doing anything, adding anything. We're talking, but we're just there with each other.
Yeah.
And if we view that as more of our natural state, not that there's one natural state, but again, that doesn't take any effort really in the purest sense. It's the transactional form that takes effort. It doesn't look like effort because that's, again, how things appear to be. But it's actually that takes effort. It takes effort to separate oneself. And why do we separate ourselves? Well, that's the natural response to overwhelming traumatic situations in life. That is what the body, or not only the body, our organism, it's how any life form relates to something that's too much. When it's too much, we separate it and we numb and dissociate that pain so we can move on with our lives. But the cost of that numbness or dissociation, or like dissociation into the mind, is another symptom.
Right.
It's too painful here. You go live up here. When all of this separation happens, that means that we don't have access to the feeling capacities that were there. And if we can't feel each other, then we separate. And when you take individual forms of overwhelm and trauma, collective forms, cultural, societal forms, all of a sudden you have this whole heap that we're standing on and living on top of. And so we're interacting in these transactional ways and we think it's normal, but actually there's so much unprocessed, unresolved pain, grief, and so on underneath. That means that transactional relationships are our way of kind of getting through life. And I'm saying this back to your initial question because I think a certain point of curiosity, humility, and understanding is important in these transactional relationships, to not judge them and not to claim that either I'm bad because I'm relating transactionally, or the other person are bad, or this is bad. No, there's actually something much deeper going on here. And if we can have some respect for that, then we don't need to fight against the transactional relationship, because then it just, as soon as we fight against it, it just gets worse, right? And instead to go,
Yeah.
oh,
Yeah.
wow, I'm protecting something here. And that's
We sort of
okay.
need just to be honest about it.
Yeah.
Okay, this is the way it is. But I can maybe you can treat the person as in the transactional exchange as a subject. And
Absolutely.
yeah, and I think that's the key.
And I think this is kind of second level, and this is something you learn in therapeutic training, is to actually name that in the moment. And I know
Mm-hmm.
several people who are amazing at this, you know. And so when there's that transactional relationship, they'll say, you know what, I noticed something's like off. It doesn't quite feel right here. Might even say, this kind of feels a bit transactional. I'm curious, what's your experience like, or what would happen if we took a different route in this relationship?
And if you're going to do that, then your relationship to yourself has to be really also very clear in that moment.
Yes. Yes. Right.
It's not to overcomplicate things. It's really not that complicated, unless you're totally in your left brain and you're looking at it from a highly analytical point of view. Then it becomes complicated. But if you've pulled that into your right brain, then it becomes much more natural and much more real, and and you're intuitively seeing what's going on, and so you actually know what to do and how to
Right.
say the right things.
So much of that is actually honoring and noticing and becoming better at noticing one's intuition, because the intuition is the radar for when these things are off or wrong. And so, yeah, honoring and noticing your intuition and then acting on it, and just acting on it because this is what's happening, not because of some intellectual analytical analysis that, oh, okay, because he said these things, it's kind of a transactional relationship. But that, no, it's just, I feel something's a bit kind of off here. Let's explore that together. Like, do you feel the same? Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, this is really great stuff, and I hope people are grasping hold of that, because if you can learn how to manage your relationships in this way, you're going to find yourself free of a lot of pressure, and you're going to find yourself becoming a resource for other people in the kind of way that you want to be, I think. So what what was it that drove you to write this? And then what is it that you'd like to see people get from this and do with this?
What led me to write it was several things. One was just deep fascination with Martin Buber's work. Uh, it just ended up scribbling all of the pages I was reading and couldn't get enough. And at a certain point, I realized, oh, wow, maybe I should do something with this. Because a lot of people engage with Martin Buber's work, especially I've noticed in Germany. Of course, I mean, he was kind of from the area or grew up in most of Central Europe when he was younger. And also in the States, I hear a lot of people who have studied him in college.
I did.
And many people who have read his work find it a bit difficult to grasp. Uh, he writes in a very interesting, lyrical, poetic style. I love it. Some people find it very difficult to engage with. But nevertheless, I saw that, oh wow, this is somehow more difficult maybe than it needs to be. And how can I, or not more than it needs to be, but given that it is 100 years later, I think there are ways in which we can bring these ideas to life um,
Mm.
in simpler ways, perhaps.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and so that was one reason. The second was I'd begun to really dive deep into becoming as effective as I could be in the work I do. And in coaching work, there are different levels you can play at that. You can kind of work at the surface tactical level, and there's nothing wrong with that. That's amazing. And yet I found myself drawn to the deeper realms of our experience. And the more I did that, the more I realized that so much of the work is actually relational. There's there's a way in which you can do coaching which is at a distance, separate. And you can ask the person over there, what are you thinking and how are you acting and what are your thought patterns and all the rest? What do you want to achieve? There's a way to actually bring relation into that encounter, and you're using the relational information to actually move deeper. So, for example, someone might feel scared when sharing something or feel vulnerable. Instead of just passing over that, you actually use that in a relational encounter.
Mm.
Because ultimately, what a lot of our pain comes from unhealthy relationships. And what can restore that and heal that is actually a more healthy relationship where we meet those emotions. We don't push them away, jump over them. We actually meet them, include them, welcome them. And so by working more relationally, I just saw that the work I was doing with people had a totally different effect. And so it was kind of a mix of wanting to bring these things together in Martin Buber's language. And then ultimately, by engaging with Martin Buber's work and others, I noticed I had a very different experience of life, which was something that was much closer, less separate. Because you can relate to life as like, yeah, there's nature out there and there's the world out there, but I'm here and it's all out there. But Buber's work is an invitation to actually realize, oh no, wow, it's not over there. I'm bound up in relationship with everything. And so if I am bound up in relation, then I will treat it very differently.
Yeah.
The world is nothing but atoms, molecules, and a resource. And there's no reason I should treat it well. But if I'm inherently part of it, and it's as much me as the rest of me and everything else here, then I'm going to treat it very differently. I'm going to have some respect, kindness, and so on in how I interact. And so all of these ideas and changes within myself and in my work uh, led me to writing this, which was essentially initially a couple of chapters or essays, really, but that then turned into a book. And so, what I'm hoping for people in this is I don't want to, I'm very careful about saying what they should or even hope they get from it because everyone gets something different, right? And that's
Yeah.
amazing.
That's great.
Um, and and if there is one thing, it is again to just play around with holding the assumption that everything is relational. And that I can relate differently in each and every moment, not only with other people, but with myself and my surroundings, and even my relationship with life itself. Even my relationship with like what's going on here. I can relate differently to that if
Yeah.
I want to. And just opening that door, I think, can yield a lot of change and a lot of new ways of being that again are less pressurized and effortful, and instead more open and okay, as we were talking about. Because if I'm at a distance from everything, I need to work to create connection, right? I see that a lot in like people wanting to be more connected. It's like I need to work hard, I need to write a bunch of texts, I need to do all these things. And as a leader, I need to like work really hard and send a bunch of messages to people and communicate a lot. That's how I become better at relationships as a leader. And it's like, no, 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 no. You only need to work hard if you're at a distance, if you're separate from everything. If you instead can start to really feel this kind of interweaving, interconnected, entangled relationship with everything and anything, then I'm a part of it. And if I'm a part of it, I'm going to take responsibility in a very different way. And so these are just some of the things that I hope might come from this, which is to just play around with how can I relate differently here? Like that question. I think that can open a whole new world of experience. How can I relate differently here?
I see I see another visit by you to the Eddie Network podcast where we talk about the same concepts in the context of one, social media,
Mm.
and in the context of networking, which is a growing need by people. And there's so much that goes into that. I'd like to do that at a separate time because um, because we've we've explored some really deep stuff today, and this has been really great. And I hope people will go find your book. Where's this for sale?
You can buy it on Amazon, on all Amazon marketplaces. Also check out my website, alexcarabi.com. You can get a free, I think it's the first chapter that's available there.
Okay, okay. So we're going to come back and talk again because
I'd love to.
we've I think we have a an I-thou relationship here formed because I think we see the analytical connections here, but we're also I think that we see that there is something deeper there, and maybe it's the fact that we both have a deep appreciation for relationships and commitment to making. I mean, my attitude is I'm walking into a place and I'm going to meet everybody I can,
Mm.
and they're an I. It's an I begin with an I thou approach to them, and then I'm looking for the I it so that I can find some way to serve them. And that's the way I approach this very topic, and
Mm.
it has worked really well, you know. But
I think
it also comes to to the reality that, and this is where social media comes in, that this is not a connection with someone.
right.
This is a direct relationship with someone, and
Right.
with direct being kind of the optimum word there.
Right, right. Connection is a word that's been abused and misunderstood and misused, I think, a
Yeah, yeah,
lot. And so
yeah,
I would love to come back at some point. I think this is a lovely kind of start to our relationship here. And I think the word you said there, meet, like when you go into the coffee shop and you meet people,
yeah.
I think that's another thing I'd like to leave people with, which is like, what does it actually mean to meet another person? And I can feel this in some moments with you here, where like we're meeting. And sometimes, there's some analytical thinking going on, and that's amazing too. And right, when you really meet someone, like what's that like? And
An encounter,
how can that happen exactly? I'm actually encountering. Yeah.
and it's an affirmation of them. When you reach out to them, you're affirming who they are. You're saying, I don't know who you are, but I am interested in who you are, and I don't want anything from you. I just want to meet you. I want to have,
Right.
and and it never fails to make a difference. Makes a difference. That's
Buber.
it's
Yeah.
it's impact.
Right. Buber talked about that as confirmation, in the sense that when you meet another in this way, you are confirming their existence. You're confirming their existence in their past, their present, and their future.
Yeah,
And so it's an amazing gift that we can give to others, not by doing anything, but by simply being there and confirming that, yes, you are here and you are here now, and I'm with you here now. That is a gift of the highest order.
yes, it is. Okay, well, we could go on all day about this. Hey, thank you, Alex. This has been
Thank you so much,
fantastic.
Ed. I really enjoyed this. Looking forward to next
Me
time.
too. And everyone, thank you for watching. And I wish you would respond, leave a question, leave a comment, as well as subscribe and like, but engage with us in conversation because this is what we're talking about. We're not just an it, we're a thou. And we would like to see you as a thou and not simply as the abstraction called a watcher or a listener. So let's talk and let's have a conversation. Thank you for watching the Eddie Network podcast, and we'll see you again real soon. Thank you very much, and see you later, Alex. Take care.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye bye.